Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strange of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman-Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unseen Paranormal. This week we are chatting with paranormal researcher and author W.T. Watson. W.T. is an Amazon best-selling author with many books to his credit, including Phantom Black Dogs, Mysteries in the Mist, Hunting the Beast, and his latest book, Sasquatch Canada Beyond British Columbia. You can find all of W.T. Watson's books on Amazon, Kindle, BarnesandNoble.com, and wherever fine books are sold. Hey W.T., welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Eric. You can call me Travis. WT is my author name.
Well, welcome to the show, Travis. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So you wrote this about the Sasquatch sightings in Canada because you're from Canada. You live there.
I'm actually originally from the United States. I was born in Texas and have lived all over the states. My spouse is a native Canadian and got a job up here in 2020, right in the middle of the freaking pandemic. So we got to do an international, cross-border move in 1 month during the pandemic, which was quite the feat. But so I've lived up here for a couple of years. So we moved up in 2020, as I said. I've lived up here for a couple of years, and that first little bit, of course, it's just like if you move to the United States from somewhere else, there's a time period where you can't work, because you don't have your necessary stuff. So, I'd already put Phantom Black Dogs and Mysteries in the Mist into publication. And I got looking around and I thought, I wonder what kind of weird stuff happens in Canada. And that was the beginning of the book Canadian Monsters and Mysteries, which released last year. And I quickly discovered that when I was looking at the strange in Canada, there's a couple of things that I was going to have to leave out because there just was the book would have been this monumental 700-page thing. One of them was hauntings. Because there's a lot of ghost history up here, which I haven't even begun to scratch the surface on yet. And then the other was Sasquatch, because, obviously, when we think of Sasquatch, people tend to think of the Pacific Northwest and then on up into British Columbia. So I wanted something a little different. So I thought to myself, well, okay, so there obviously are a lot of sightings in British Columbia. There's folks that call that Sasquatch Central. But I wanted to know, okay, well, so are there sightings in the rest of Canada? And oh boy, are there. I got researching this, and it's just a cornucopia of Sasquatchery. All over the country, really. The only province that I didn't find any kind of indication of Sasquatch sightings in was none of it. And that may be just because of the terrain there. It may also be because primarily indigenous folks there, and those people are not quite as willing to talk about their stories as others might be, unless they know you. So, but that's really the only place I didn't find anything about Sasquatch at all. And then when you're talking about, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and on into Quebec, we're just thick with them. So what most people don't realize about Canada is that it's actually the second largest country in the world. This is a point I make every time I talk about this book. Second largest country in the world, longest coastline in the world. And most of the people in this country live within 150 miles of the U.S. border. So there are vast swaths of wilderness area here. I can drive a couple hours north from where I am in the Kitchener-Waterloo area and be in dense forest. Additionally, we've got all that wilderness area. Canada's one of those countries that has its own Lazarus species. the wood bison, which is actually the largest land mammal in North America by weight, was actually declared extinct back in the early 1900s. And a forestry officer in Alberta, I believe, was doing an overflight of an area and found a herd of 200 wood bison in Canada. They'd been hiding them in the woods there.
Yeah.
They'd been hiding them in the woods there for 40 or 50 years. Yeah, all of those things kind of combine together for me to make the possibility of Sasquatch even more likely. Whether you're talking about a physical, bipedal hominid or ape or whatever else Sasquatch might be.
Yeah, and I find it interesting, and I really didn't realize this, but there's not a lot of books or researchers that are focusing on the Bigfoot research and stuff in Canada. It seems to be the Pacific Northwest or like the Smoky Mountains, not far from where I live, in the United States. And it's interesting that it's all focused on the United States, a lot of it.
Yeah, a lot of it is. If you read the classics of Sasquatch lore, whether you're talking about John Green's books or Renee DeHenden or Lauren Coleman or any of those guys, Canada gets a mention. Again, like I said, if it's going to get a mention, it's going to be British Columbia. A lot of times. There was Lauren Coleman actually talks about a case up in Cobalt, Ontario, called Golden Top. The creature's actually got a nickname because it had this strange kind of blonde hair on the top of its head. And occasionally you'd find reference to the Bighorn Dam sightings in Alberta. For the most part, they're just, because I looked at a lot of the, I looked at a lot of the Bigfoot books that I've read over the course of years. There's not a lot of Sasquatch lore that comes out of Canada other than the British Columbia area. So I wanted to, kind of rectify that lack. And there's tons more stuff to research. There are some dedicated researchers up here. There's an organization called Sasquatch Canada or Canada Sasquatch. I can never remember whether it's one or the other. There's also a very active group in Alberta Sasquatch, that has a great website that I recommend to people. There are folks that are doing Sasquatch research in Northern Ontario. So, they're out there, but they're not putting out a lot of content, I guess.
Yeah.
You've got these little websites and stuff, and but other than Tom Steenberg, who works with the Alberta Sasquatch people, actually wrote the book on Sasquatch in Alberta. Other than that, and John Worm's book, Strange Creatures Seldom Seen, there's not. There's just not a lot of lore about Sasquatch in the other provinces besides BC.
Yeah, and you think, especially for a good majority of the Bigfoot community believes that this is, just an undiscovered ape species. You have like the North American Wood Ape Conservancy and people like that they would kind of focus because there is so much unexplored land. And that's where you would, like you were saying with the bison, it was missing for 40 or 50 years before it was rediscovered. So you figured maybe more attention would be put on somewhere like Canada because there is sightings and there apparently is, populations up there of these creatures, and they have a vast majority of wilderness, more so than the United States, to kind of hide out. And
they have a lot of room to move around in.
Without coming into contact with people. Yeah,
exactly. And that to me is one of the things, if you're going to argue for the presence of Sasquatch as a physical creature, that to me is one of the primary arguing points. Is we have vast amounts of wilderness in Canada, and that wilderness will support a large apex predator. Because we have brown bears up here.
Right.
This is a large apex predator. We have wolves. We have mountain lion. We have all kinds of large creatures that would consume a lot of calories. That live up in these woods. So there's no reason why a very large, hominid or ape couldn't live up here, other than dealing with the cold.
Yeah, and also if it's an intelligent creature, which it seems to be from many accounts, that it would actively kind of stay away from humans to begin with, because in a lot of down here in the United States, like in a lot of national parks, they've kind of gotten the bears scared of gunfire and things. And if they're smart enough to learn to stay away from people for the most part, you figure these more intelligent creatures would as well.
Yeah, this is one of the great mysteries of Sasquatchery, in my view, is like, on the one hand, Sasquatch is, the hide and seek champion of the world, right?
Right.
I mean, because we're talking about a creature, if we're listening to the testimony, a creature that's 8 feet tall and well over 500 pounds. It's huge. I mean, the thing that comes across most strongly in almost every Sasquatch encounter is how big these critters are. They just freak the heck out of people from the sheer size of the thing. But, when you're talking about, remaining undiscovered for a long period of time, then you have to give it credit for being elusive. On the other hand, if indeed we're talking about a physical creature. The interesting thing to me, though, is that at the same time, while these beings would have to be incredibly elusive, they also seem to be really curious about people. Because there's some good examples in the Canadian stories about Sasquatch doing the window peeping thing.
Yeah.
So kind of a funny story from, I think it's from Alberta, the local RCMP detachment, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who are the kind of federal law enforcement here in Canada, but do local jurisdictions as well. Our RCMP detachment was getting complaints from an indigenous village because there was a creature that was coming into the village and kept peeping in people's windows, looking in people's windows, and it was scaring the crap out of people. And they wanted the Mounties to do something about it. This was an example of a time when the Mounties did not get their man. But and the Mounties were basically like, "What do you want us to do about it? We can't catch it. It's like it doesn't. It's not like it's standing out in the middle of the public square when we come to check things out." But these creatures appear to be curious about people. And the other thing that you see over and over and over again in Sasquatch lore is roadside sightings. There's a whole chapter in my book about all through the provinces of Sasquatch that have been seen along the sides of roads.
I like that you titled the chapter, "Why Does Sasquatch Cross the Road?"
Yeah. You would think that a creature that was really interested in not being seen by people would avoid roads.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, because it just seems counterintuitive that the majority, almost, I would venture to say the majority of sightings happen along roadsides. And it's not that the Sasquatch can't figure out that, that there are people in the cars and people can see them. There's a good story in the book about a young man in Ontario, not too far from where I am. But this was back in the 60s when things were less developed. He and his parents were driving to a hotel or another location. He happened to look out of the back window of their vehicle as they were driving along. And they started to stop for a stop sign, and the brake lights came on, and he saw a Sasquatch cross the road behind him. Now, that made me wonder, okay, if this creature is crossing the road behind this car, how many people have missed sightings of a Sasquatch because the Sasquatch waited until they'd driven by before it crossed the road?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, because we have so many instances of these creatures crossing the road in front of a car and seeming not to pay attention to the car in the least. They'll be walking along, they're minding their own business, they're doing their thing, they'll cross the road or whatever it is. Don't even seem to it's almost like they're not grokking that there's a vehicle there. It's very unusual. It's one of the things that gives me pause about the whole Sasquatch thing is it's like these creatures seem to be, from all the witnesses' statements, seem to be very intelligent. Yeah, you would think that they would be very careful to avoid vehicles, but
Right.
they aren't. And they demonstrate that repeatedly.
Yeah. One of the things I didn't realize until I read your book was that there's actual classification of encounters.
Yeah, that's something I think that probably came from BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, because they started grouping their sightings that came into their database as Class A. In other words, there was a visual sighting of the creature. Class B, there's stuff going on that makes people think there's a Sasquatch in the bush, and I'm actually working on a book about that right now. That's going to be my next thing. Then there's Class C sightings, and I don't really understand why they divided things out. I guess a Class C is kind of a very minor Class B sighting. There's some indication that there's something out there, but we don't really know what it was. Yeah, so and a lot of people have kind of bought into that classification system, and it seems handy for grouping things together. I focused in the book on visual sightings because, as I said, because there's so many of these Class B encounters. I can't call them sightings because I didn't see anything. So many of these Class B encounters that I want to deal with them separately. But yeah, there's definitely a classification system, and a lot of people are, even if they're not using Class A, Class B, Class C, a lot of folks that are doing websites now are, they'll head their sightings, visual sighting, to give people kind of an idea of what classification that sighting is in.
Yeah, and Class B would kind of be like wood structures and nest and things like that.
Oh yeah, there's a wide variety of phenomena that are attributed to Sasquatch. Footprints, of course, being the most famous thing, of course. But you do, as you say, have the tree structures. There are reports in some places of something hanging prey animals in trees. I read an interesting report from Montana about the Sasquatch hot zone, I guess, where they kept finding deer up in trees. If you were in Africa, you'd think it was a leopard,
Right.
But we don't have anything. Mountain lions don't drag their prey into trees. That's not the way they work. So we don't really know how this stuff is getting up there. You got tracks, you got vocalizations. You have the scary feeling that people get sometimes. It's like, I knew something was watching me. It's probably one of the most common phrases in Sasquatch encounter of any kind, whether it's a visual sighting or more of the Class B. That whole, I felt like something was watching me. There's also some evidence of what some researchers think of as nests, or areas that have been cleared out that look like sleeping areas or whatever. So there's a whole other set of things that are associated with the Class B type sightings that I think deserve attention all their own, which is why I'm looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah. And is there, I know, that animals don't care about borders, but I know Canada, has a colder climate than like we do in the United States, even in the like Pacific Northwest and things. Did you find any major differences between the way that people describe Sasquatch in Canada versus the United States, or are they kind of similar, same?
I would say that if, you of course are probably familiar with skunk ape in Florida, which tends to be a smaller, wiry-er creature.
Yeah.
The Sasquatch in Canada tend to follow that law that, the colder the climate, the bigger the creature. They are definitely on par with the kind of Sasquatch reports that you get from the Pacific Northwest. Your typical sighting is of, large bipedal creature, broad shoulders. People frequently compare them to football players. Very little neck, the conical head, sort of an ape-like face, very typically is described. So they tend to look a lot like the ones in the Northwest. Interesting story, though, is that in Alberta, at the Bighorn Dam site, there were witnesses who were and in the surrounding areas. So there were native people who were moving through the area as well. At that site, there's a fairly famous sighting by 3 people who saw one of these creatures standing up on a ridgeline about half a mile away. They were looking at the trees and trying to judge how tall this creature was. And when they got to that area and took some measurements against, the places that they'd marked, they estimated that this creature was somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall.
Wow.
Now, this is one of the things that really bugs me, okay, is when you get a so-called expert in who says, oh, well, that couldn't possibly be the case because Sasquatch are this tall.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened here, is that the so-called experts came in and said, oh, well, you must be mistaken. And, the book that I was looking at just cracked me up because they went to extreme drawings and diagrams and mapping and all of this stuff to prove that the witnesses couldn't have actually seen what they saw. That this creature couldn't have possibly been that tall. Now, and this makes me laugh because in any population of animals, you're going to have some that are larger than others.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm a prime example. I'm 6'7". So, by that logic, I must not exist because I'm not the average height for a North American male.
Right.
I mean, to say that Sasquatch has to be X number of, it can only be 8 to 10 feet tall or whatever. Apparently there was a pituitarily enhanced Sasquatch in that area, or several of them in that area of Alberta. But in general, yeah, the Sasquatch in Ontario or in Canada, I'm sorry, tend to be pretty similar to the kinds of descriptions that you get in the Pacific Northwest.
Also, I like how you, in the book, you put a chapter on native beliefs, because I think that plays in to their stories and their folklore. I think definitely plays into this because of their beliefs of thinking that, Sasquatch and things like that are just part of the natural world and they just accept it. Yeah.
Well, in all of the native tribes that I've looked at, whether you're talking about the Cree or the Algonquin or some of the Pacific Northwestern tribes, so forth, they all have a word for this creature. It is a fact to them. There's no, it's not like, oh, we must prove that Sasquatch exists. It's like there's no need to prove it because they know it's there. There's no ifs, ands, buts, maybes about it. In fact, these creatures are so accepted by the native people in Canada that, for instance, there is a kind of a pan-tribal movement to teach young Indigenous kids some of the virtues of traditional Native Canadian ways. And those virtues are all illustrated by animals. Wolf does this thing, bear does this thing, blah, blah, blah. And Sabe, which is the Sasquatch, is seen as, I believe he's the keeper of honesty. It's like all of these other animals are creatures that exist, that are acknowledged by the zoological community and so forth.
Right.
As far as the native people are concerned, Sasquatch is as real as a wolf or a bear or, any of the other things. The difference is that many of these tribes view these creatures as either a protector of the tribe or a protector of the forest, and they view it as being a spiritual creature that can actually assume physical manifestation. So basically, Sasquatch is a world walker in their view. And I kind of like that idea because it really, it does help to explain some of the weirdness that goes on around Sasquatch sightings.
Yeah, and in the Sasquatch world, Bigfoot world, you kind of have the two different camps. You have the one that believes it's a physical lost ape species, and you have the other that they call it woo. I think is their term for it, for the magical properties of Bigfoot, disappearing and cloaking and things like that.
Well, I think that there's room for both thoughts. Okay. because there are some really weird stories about Sasquatches. Okay, but on the other hand, again, I point out vast wilderness areas, plenty of room for an undiscovered creature to live in, especially one that's very intelligent and very elusive. If somebody actually pulled a Sasquatch body out of the Canadian forest, I wouldn't be, taken aback or surprised.
Yeah.
I think that there is the possibility of a physical creature. I also think that the natives are onto something, and that there's something more to some of the creatures in some of these sightings. Okay, I have a whole section in the book called "Strange Things." It's another chapter in the book that talks about sightings where, for instance, there's a gentleman driving up in I think near Yellowknife in the Yukon, observed a Sasquatch on the side of the road, typical roadside sighting, except that as he's watching this creature, it becomes transparent and then completely vanishes from sight. It didn't run into the forest. It didn't, it didn't camouflage itself or anything. It just poof, gone. There's also a story in that section about a young man who was coming back from the river where he had been frolicking with his family, and he was coming back for lunch and encountered one of these creatures squatting next to a Saskatoon berry bush, if I recall. He said it was massive. It was probably 5 feet tall, squatting on its heels, and at least 4 feet wide. He's so shocked that he's thinking to himself, what am I seeing, or what am I looking at? And he very clearly hears a voice in his head say, you don't see me, I'm not here. So we get the whole mind speak thing going on too. There's a very clear voice in his head. And so there are some weird things about some of these sightings that make me think that there's a certain percentage of these encounters that are maybe not so much aligned to a physical creature. But again, I don't discount the possibility that there's actually a physical animal as well.
Yeah, and then you get one of the things that I have thought about, because I've talked about time slips here on the show. Maybe some of these things are when people are seeing a Sasquatch. I mean, we've had, Neanderthals and things like that live in the past, so maybe it's just a bunch of different explanations where, sometimes people are seeing a time slip or maybe even a ghost of a Sasquatch. If you're out in the wilderness and you see a bear, it could be a bear ghost, but you're not, you're not going to question if it's real or not. You're going to run the other way.
You're not going to go running up there and say, "Oh, let's see, I'm going to poke this bear and see if it's alive, if it's a real thing or not."
Right.
Might be a good way to lose a hand. But yeah, I mean, I talk about this kind of in the conclusion to the book too. Is there's one of the problems that we have. We as humans, not just kind of in general, have is that we tend to get locked into a particular mindset. And when you're exploring these mysteries, you need to be comfortable with things being mysteries. When I did Mysteries in the Mist, which is about mist, fog, and clouds in the paranormal, there were a couple of stories in that book about people seeing things coming out of or going into clouds that, gave you the impression that, there was a time slip, some kind of anomalous time anomaly, right? So why not a situation where, Gigantopithecus wanders into a cloud somewhere and pops into our reality for a little while.
Right.
And then goes back. Again, as you said, the ghost hypothesis is another one. It could be the ghost of something that used to exist. Some of these sightings, not all of them, because some of these creatures obviously interact physically with their environment. So less of the ghosty stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you could look at it. The roadside sightings. If you've ever, I'm sure you've probably been on a long, drive at some point where you kind of slipped into that highway hypnosis mindset, right? Which is, everything that we know about psi and psychic functioning says that it works best when the person is in kind of a relaxed, trancy state of mind, right? So who's to say that, there's not something on the other side of the veil that people are psychically picking up on during these roadside encounters, kind of hypnotic roadside encounters, people are picking up on, and their brain is interpreting as a Sasquatch. So, I mean, we could get way into that territory, but the vast majority of the sightings in the book are very much like wildlife sightings. Some fellow is out, or female person is out, hunting moose in the woods and sees this giant creature, and from the way they're talking about it, a lot of times it's almost like they saw a bear or they saw a moose or whatever. In fact, a lot of times these folks will say, I thought it was a bear at first, and then it stood up.
Yeah.
Or I thought it was the back end of a moose until I got a different angle on it and I could see what it actually was. It's one of the most common things that you hear from people, from witnesses, is that they'll tell their family or whatever, and invariably somebody will say, it was just a bear. And the most common rejoinder to that is, I know what a bear looks like. That wasn't a bear. And I talk about the Traverse Spine gorilla, which is a great historical Sasquatch sighting. And there's this hysterical incident. The lady that whose family this Sasquatch seemed to kind of like to hang out around their house actually caught this creature, peeking into the window again. Scared the kids. The kids screamed. Mama picks up a shotgun and runs outside and takes a shot at this thing. She claims that she hit it. Well, many years later, she's being interviewed by some academic who's trying to tell her that she shot a very rare barren grizzly bear. And she looked at him and told him he was full of crap. She says, I know what a bear looks like. I killed 12 of them while I was living out in the range. I know what a bear looks like. This wasn't a bear. It's kind of like talking about the Appalachians. It's kind of like somebody trying to tell one of those folks who's lived out there, who knows the wildlife, who's been hunting since they were old enough to walk, that they saw a bear when they know they didn't. It's the same kind of thing. It's just it always amazes me that there's people, whether it's academics or park rangers or whatever, that are always trying to tell witnesses they didn't see what they saw, instead of listening to them and saying, "Oh, well, tell me more."
Right. Well, and with so many sightings, it's hard to dismiss all of them as misidentification of a bear or something else. And like you're saying, these people who have grown up in the woods, hunting these woods, they lived in them their entire lives. They know every creature that roams these woods. But yeah, you're going to tell them that like that lady, I've shot 12 bears. I know what a bear looks like. You're going to try to tell them they're wrong.
I know what a bear looks like. Yeah. And you have a really strong outdoor culture here in Canada. You'd think everybody would huddle inside and try to avoid freezing, but they're out there. It's one of the things that's just always impressed me about Canadians since I've been up here, is that they'll be out in all kinds of weather. Doesn't matter. Go for a walk, take the dogs out, whatever. Walk by and say, hey, it's kind of brisk out. It's 20 below Celsius. Like, okay, yeah, it's pretty brisk out here.
Yeah.
But in a lot of these folks grow up out in the woods, hunting, backpacking, camping, fishing, doing outdoor pursuits. So they know what the local wildlife looks like. And then when you start to talk about sightings that happen to indigenous people, we're talking about people that not only spend a lot of time out there, but actually live there. Because most of the native reserves here are pretty isolated. I mean, there are a few that are close to what we call civilization, but a lot of the native peoples live out in the middle of nowhere, basically. in fairly primitive conditions. There's a story that a young native girl who got lost and actually had a Sasquatch help her find her way back. But she was in the process of going down to the stream and getting water to take back to the house, to the cabin where she lived. And she got off. She decided to stop and pick some berries and got lost. And there was a whole story attached to that. But she actually runs into a Sasquatch while she's out in the woods, and she's sure that she's about to get eaten because she thinks it's a bear. It's very, very dark, so she doesn't know what she's actually contacted until the sun starts to come up, and then she tries to run away from it. And the Sasquatch keeps catching up to her and bouncing her off in a particular direction. Eventually, it keeps bumping her from side to side. It's kind of like playing bumper cars until it gets her out to a road that she recognizes. It's a great story. A young lady named Carrie. But so these creatures are out there, and the people that are out in the woods are encountering them. And while it's possible that some of these sightings, particularly for people who aren't real familiar with local wildlife, could be misidentification of bears.
Right.
So like I said, one of the most common things that you hear from Sasquatch witnesses is, "I know what a bear looks like. That wasn't a bear."
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like they're very emphatic about it.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things that you hear from skeptics is, why haven't you found a body? Well, go out in the wilderness and look and try to find a bear carcass or any kind of animal carcass, because there are scavengers that out there scatter the bones. They break the bones open for the marrow and things like that. And so, that's the way Mother Nature works.
Yeah. And, if you've had any length of time for a corpse to be out in the woods, once those bones are scattered and stuff, it's practically impossible to tell what they came from. So you could, people could have wandered across Sasquatch bones and had no idea, unless you happen to find a massive skull or something. But that's not going to happen because they do break down. So that's one explanation. Another explanation, this is something that was put forward by a number of researchers. The one that comes to mind is Tom Powell, who wrote The Locals, is that Sasquatch may actually bury their dead. He was of the opinion, and I'm inclined to agree with him, that if you see one Sasquatch, there's probably more than one in the woods around you.
Yeah.
This is why one of the things that I tell people if they ask me is, if you are armed and you're out in the woods, don't even think about shooting at one of those things. I think you're taking your life in your hands if you do that.
Right.
Because there's liable to be others. And, even if you do succeed in shooting one of these creatures, it may go badly for you. I have one story of a young man who was out hunting moose and actually claims to have shot a Sasquatch. And he, as so often happens, he was hunting illegally. And so he bailed out and couldn't really tell anybody about what he had seen and what had happened because he wasn't supposed to be out there in the first place.
Yeah.
It wasn't moose season. So, but there's a number of stories where people claim to have either shot one or whatever, but never can find the body. And that makes you wonder, okay, if these creatures are as intelligent as we think they are, maybe they're actually taking care of their dead. I mean, if it is a hominid, for instance, they may have developed some kind of, funereal customs. We don't know. That's one of the fun things about doing this kind of research is you don't know. It's a mystery. And that's the fun part about it. I think that, if somebody did actually wave a magic wand and actually explain all this stuff, it would just take all the fun out of it. Yeah. I mean, I enjoy this precisely because there's all kinds of things to think about. and theories to have and hypotheses and so forth. So that's half the fun of it.
Yeah, and to realize that just because we're an intelligent species on this planet doesn't mean that the world's not way bigger than we realize.
Yeah, and we're not the only intelligent species on the planet either. One of the things that you can look to our primate relatives and the fact that gorillas are able to learn extensive sign language and chimpanzees too, I think. But from if you move back into native lore and the lore of indigenous people, and you get into that more animist worldview, then you suddenly discover that you're supposed to be living in a whole ecosystem of physical beings, that we can see and smell and touch, and then spiritual beings that we can't so much see and smell and touch. So, when you look at the world from that angle, it becomes a much bigger place and a much more mysterious place, and strange things can happen.
Right.
So,
yeah.
And that's, again, one of the things I tend to approach things from an animist perspective. So I listen to witnesses. I believe what they tell me, and unless I have good reason not to. And some of the things that you find, some of the stories that I've collected are just like, okay.
Yeah, and like we were talking about, how can you discredit all of these people?
Mm-hmm.
From not just Canada, United States, but all over the world. I mean, you have the Yeti and things like that. And just kind of sightings all over the world and from different cultures. Yeah,
I mean, just in the lore of what I call Sasquatch, some people call Bigfoot, some people call them Yeti. There's the Almaste in Russia. There's the Woodwoes in Europe and so forth. These creatures, whatever they are, have a long history. And have been, it's not just something that fell out of the sky in the 1950s, because somebody was in Northern California and saw some big footprints. They have been around in stories, almost back to the founding of the United States, for instance, or Canada. The early explorers here in North America had footprint encounters and those kinds of things going on. So this creature's been around for a long time, and it's engendered, plenty of speculation, but nobody's ever figured out what it is, and they certainly haven't caught one. So
I say all the time, especially the paranormal stuff, that a lot of the times it's not the destination, it's a journey to get there. Like you're saying, the research and talking about it, and getting into the esoteric stuff, and it's the kind of the journey of getting there. If we ever found one improved, a lot of people would be out of a job, for one. That's kind of the I was talking to J.W. Oker, and he, in his book, he did a book called United States of Cryptids, and in the one chapter at the end, he said the curse of the cryptozoologist, and we talked about that, and the curse of the cryptozoologist is actually proving these things are true. Because that means the end of cryptozoology just becomes mainstream science at that point.
Yeah, it just becomes zoology at that point.
Yeah.
And it's like, so if you pull Ogopogo out of a lake in British Columbia, it's Lake Okanagan, then that one's, you can mark that off your list and it becomes just another species, right?
Right, yeah.
I think that you'd have a harder time with the Sasquatch, because even if you did pull one of these critters out of the wild and quote unquote prove its existence, that still doesn't explain some of the weird stuff that people encounter with this particular creature. Yeah, I agree. Curse of the cryptozoologist is actually being proven right.
Right.
Because everybody likes to say, oh, well, it's all entirely possible that there are unknown species on the planet. Look at the coelacanth. It's like, yeah, coelacanth was supposed to be extinct. They pulled one out of the ocean, and now it's just another fish.
Yeah.
It's a very rare fish, but it's still just another fish, right? You've peeled the mystery away from it, and it takes all the fun out of it.
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, I was joking that the cryptozoologists hate to see Forrest Galante show up because he's out rediscovering supposed extinct species, and it was his grandfather that rediscovered the coelacanth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty sure I've watched his show on National Geographic, and it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have an interest in like unknown species and that kind of stuff, or not unknown, but things that maybe are more Lazarus species that we thought were extinct and now have discovered that they're not. But, with a lot of these mysteries that we're involved with, I think that there's kind of this dynamic tension there where on the one hand, you have this large body of, for instance, Bigfoot researchers who just love to plug one of these creatures and drag it out of the woods. And so just so that they could point and say, look, see, I was right. All these years I've been chasing this thing around in the woods and I was right. But if you did that, think about what kind of effect that would have, kind of rolling effect it would have on the way woodlands and forests and so forth are viewed and protected from that point forward. Because you can't, even if Sasquatch is actually a relic hominid or a bipedal ape or something along that line, they can't be really thick on the ground.
Right.
So immediately you're going to have an endangered species in the forest all over North America.
Right.
I mean, just think about the ramifications of that. Just from a forestry management kind of aspect, there are people on the conspiracy side that theorize that part of the reason we haven't been able to prove there's a Sasquatch is because the government's covering it up, right? I don't know that I particularly buy that, but it would make sense for these interests that have a lot of money invested in forest land to keep that kind of a thing quiet if it did actually happen.
Here in Tennessee, we have the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Oh yeah,
and it's the most visited national park in the country. And so, if suddenly we prove that, they pulled one out of the Smoky Mountains, then you're going to have a bunch of tourists being like, well, I'm not going there,
It'd be just the opposite for me. I'd be like, oh, hell yeah, let's go.
Right, right.
I mean, I've been wanting to get up to Algonquin Provincial Park because there have been several sightings up around that area. I'd love to go up and spend some time up there and see if I can't nose one out myself. I've not ever, actually had a sighting. I just have been fascinated with the Sasquatch subject since I was a kid, though. I was one of those geeky, paranormal geek kids who had read, Ivan Sanderson by the time I was in 6th grade, so I just have always been into this stuff, and I'm over 60 now, so it's been a long time.
Yeah, I was kind of a geeky kid too with the paranormal stuff. My forte is ghost, and in hauntings and things. I've been a paranormal investigator and researcher on that front for a long time. But I was that same type of kid reading, the book fair at school. I'm looking for the alien, Bigfoot, ghost books. And,
I've always been a generalist. The guy that I admired when I was growing up was Frank Edwards, who wrote books like Strange World and Stranger Than Science. Just these 40 collections of just weirdness, right?
Yeah.
And a couple of my books have been like that. Mysteries in the Mist and Canadian Monsters and Mysteries are both just collections of just weirdness, which I really enjoy putting together. I started off. I got started because my dad was actually a UFO experiencer. He had a sighting in the 50s out in California, pretty up close sighting of one of those cigar-shaped vessels that had the portals along the side, and as he described it, this eerie purple light shining out through the thing and onto the road in front of his car. Shook him up pretty bad, and my dad was never one to hold his opinions about anything, but he really get going if somebody started dissing on UFOs, because he's like, I know they're real because I saw one.
Yeah.
He'd be happy to let you know all about it.
That's pretty amazing though, to have that sort of sighting.
Yeah, he was so convinced that he was fairly certain there was a UFO base in the hill country of Texas and all this other stuff, right? I mean, because once he'd seen one, he was sure they were there, and they were there all the time. So
yeah,
I'd be interested. He's long dead now, but I wish sometimes that I could have spent more time quizzing him about that sighting and what all happened to him, while that was going on. Because he would tell the story, and then he would go on to his other stuff, and so I got the story, but I don't always think that I got the full story, and I'm wondering if he didn't have some missing time at that point.
Yeah. Well, so the Sasquatch Canada book, Beyond British Columbia, just came out not too long ago. And you said you're working on some other projects. So what you got coming up in the future?
Sasquatch Canada came out right before Christmas in 2022. And like I said, I am currently doing a deep dive into those Class B sightings, where, you've got the stick structures, the footprints, the vocalizations, the thing in the woods, what I call the silence, where, people notice that it's suddenly become eerily silent, things like that. And I'm looking at maybe some alternative explanations besides Sasquatch to that, in addition to Sasquatch, I guess you could say. Because some of those kinds of experiences result in people having visual sightings, but a lot of them don't. I'm thinking about the Snellgrove Lake incident, where the Monster Quest crew was up there doing their Sasquatch attacks episode, and the last night they were there, they had an incident of rocks being thrown at the cabin. So they all freak out and go back in the cabin, and they're huddled around their camera, like, oh my God, there's rocks falling on the roof. I'm like, dude, you'd think that they'd be out looking in the woods, right? So they have one poor lone hapless cameraman standing out on the porch, scanning that area with infrared and night vision. And, there's rocks flying out and hitting the house, but he's not seeing anything in the woods out there. So those kinds of, and we saw, how many times do we see this happen on, like Finding Bigfoot, where they'd have howls and they'd have all this stuff going on, and, they'd have, things happening in the woods, but they never could get a good, like they had thermal imaging, they had night vision, they had all of this modern technology stuff out there, but nobody could get a look at this critter, right?
Right.
So the hide and seek champion of the world. So I'm going to propose some Sasquatch and non-Sasquatch alternatives to the Class B sightings in this next book.
Yeah, I have to check that out and have you back on the show to chat about gifting and all those things that come along that we didn't talk about today.
Oh, yeah. Well, I didn't get into a lot of that in this book because I really wanted to focus on the visual sightings that people had actually seen a Sasquatch here in Canada. And, and just to let people know that, there's tons of Bigfoot sightings up here.
Yeah.
If you, care to explore and do some research. That was my big purpose for this book. I'm going to get a little more woo in the next one.
Well, like we've been talking about, there's room for all of it because none of us know. So,
Yeah, exactly.
So it kind of come at it from all different angles.
It's like I said, there's no such thing as an expert in this field.
Right.
Now there are people that I, have great respect for that have been out there doing this stuff, out in the woods for years and years and years. And, I have every admiration for those folks, but most of them will tell you there are no experts in this field either.
Yeah. And I try to tell people that, a lot of the times that's just TV BS, that, it's the producers that put the expert tag on people.
Oh,
They don't necessarily want it. They hate it, but it's just kind of a necessary evil of TV, I guess, if you want to be on TV.
Yeah. If you want to be on TV, or, I mean, I guess what you have to understand is that these shows, for the most part, these shows are entertainment,
right?
And they have to cater to the audience, and part of catering to the audience is, oh, look, we have this expert who's going to tell us about Bigfoot, or going to tell us about Dogman, or whatever, ghosts, or the paranormal, or whatever. And there are certainly people who have a extensive knowledge of the lore of whatever phenomena it is that you happen to be talking about. But I think most of those people would be like, expert? No, I'm not an expert. I just know something about this, about what people have told me, things that I've seen, testimony that I've run into, and that kind of stuff, stories I've collected.
Yeah. I'm of the same opinion. I've been doing this since I was a teenager, researching and investigating, like I said, the ghost phenomena, spirits and things like that. But yeah, I've done it for 25 years, but yeah, I'm nowhere near an expert, because every time you think you have an answer to a question, there's 1,000 more questions.
Yeah. And there's some aspect of the phenomena that's going to prove you wrong.
Right.
If you think that there's some aspect of the phenomena. The thing that pops into my mind is William Roll telling a group of people in a poltergeist haunting that poltergeist didn't strike people, and then getting slapped in the face. Yeah. As soon as you think you know something in this field, it's going to turn around and try to prove you wrong.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Travis. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you. It's always good to speak with someone who's like-minded.
Yeah, it's truly my pleasure. Thank you so much. Everybody go out and check out W.T. Watson's books. Like I said, they're on Amazon, Kindle, BarnesandNoble.com, wherever fine books are sold, and I will have all those links in the show notes to find him on social medias and all that good stuff. But thanks again for coming on, and hopefully your next book comes out, I can have you on again.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a great time. Thank you.
All right, everybody, stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Have a good day. Thank you for listening to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Join us next week for an all-new, amazing guest. And in the meantime, please go on Spotify or Apple and give us a rate and a review. And go over to YouTube and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would like to submit your story, you can email it to unseenparanormalpodcast@gmail.com, and you can remain anonymous if you like. Once again, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. Stay safe out there.